Hello and welcome to Security Scan. I am Uday Bhaskar. Before I introduce my guests, a word about this program, Security Scan. It seeks to provide an informed and objective perspective on security developments relevant to India. This week, the spotlight is on the just concluded IGA or Inter-Government Agreement between India and France for the supply of 36 Rafale fighter aircraft. The Indian Air Force, it may be recalled, has been seeking the induction of 126 fighter aircraft since 2001 to fill the gap of obsolescence. And it had identified two aircraft, the Eurofighter and the Rafale. This was about 5 years ago, and the Modi government has finally taken the decision now. But remember, the first aircraft will arrive in India only 3 years later. This is a very versatile aircraft, and today we will go beyond the agreement and contextualize the Rafale with France and look at other aspects of this particular decision. What does it mean for India? How can we locate it in the larger strategic context of Asia? But before I get there, allow me to introduce my guests. Air Marshal Matheswaran, a seasoned fighter pilot and a former Deputy Chief of the Integrated Defence Staff. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you.
Air Vice Marshal Srivastava, a Senior Technical Officer of the Indian Air Force, currently with L&T. He's a man who's also worked in the public sector. You were with BDL, right?
Yes.
And Mr. Amitabha Pande, a former Secretary to the Government of India, who had a long innings in the Ministry of Defence. A full 5 years, Amitabh, if I remember right?
Long time ago.
There you are. But let me turn to you, Matt, first. The aircraft itself, how would you assess it and how would you compare it with Asia's other air forces?
Well, thank you, sir. The aircraft, firstly, I think finally we've concluded this agreement, and we can see visibility on the first aircraft coming into the Indian Air Force 3 years from now. The Rafale is a 4.5 generation aircraft. When it comes in, it will be, in terms of sophistication and operational capability, it will be the best aircraft in the region. The best that the Pakistanis can put up against the Rafale would be the F-16 Block 52, which is a generation behind, in my opinion. And what the Chinese have, which would probably come anywhere close to it, is the J-10 and the Su-30 version J-11 that they operate. Both are way behind the Rafale. The Chinese are working on the 5th generation fighter program, which is called the T-20, which is still years away from that process.
But one more sort of additional point, why do we call this a versatile aircraft? What are the characteristics?
It is a multi-role aircraft, and right from the beginning of the design process, the French had mandated that one single aircraft should be able to swing into many roles: air defense, deep strike, interdiction, maritime role, and reconnaissance. So
it's a wide spectrum.
It's a wide spectrum. And what that actually results is that Air Forces then and the militaries then can go on to virtually a single type of aircraft to go into many different roles, and you will get away from the pain of multiple varieties that afflict
platforms,
which Indian Air Force is very well known for that.
Air Marshal Srivastava, if I could request you to pick up this thread, when he says that this is going to be the most versatile and the most modern aircraft 3 years from now when the Air Force acquires it, what are these technical characteristics which give it the edge as far as this platform is concerned?
See, what excites me about this aircraft as an engineer and having spent about 35 years in Air Force is that it's so easy to maintain. When you talk of ease of maintenance, let's say we want to change the aero engine. In this aircraft, I can possibly change in just 30 minutes as against
30 minutes?
30
wow.
minutes. As against 8 hours, which I'll take normally for a Su-30 aircraft. After change of the engine, I need not even give the ground run. The aircraft is ready for the sortie. And if you couple that with the ops requirement, what Matsy sir has told, you find a very potent combination coming through. And the combination is that I can generate larger number of sorties, maybe 5 sorties per aircraft per day in an ops environment, which is huge, which is a big takeoff. So taking that point into consideration, I would say, yes, this is a very well done by the government. I must compliment the government for this kind of deal.
So
which
let me
has come
just
through.
press this point a little more. Would it be fair then to conclude that when you look at the existing inventory of the Indian Air Force, for instance, the MiGs or the Sukhois, that the operational availability of the Rafale will be of a higher order?
Very high order.
Okay. So that
If
itself
you
is a
really
very
ask me,
significant.
very high order. That's a very significant change.
And
But what I'm looking forward to as an industry man now, been in the industry for last 6-7 years, I feel the challenge is, can we use this strategic deal, if you allow me to call it, because first of its kind in the century, to really pitch for getting the ecosystem into place.
Okay, PK, hold on to that thought. I'm going to come back to it in a moment, but let me turn to Mr. Pande. Amitabh, we said in the course of this introductory remarks that the Indian Air Force had mooted the requirement of 126 fighter aircraft 2000-2001. This is when Mr. Vajpayee was Prime Minister. Now we are in 2016. So what do you have to say? I mean, I'm not holding you culpable for this. I'm just asking you to share your thoughts about this very long timeline for decision making.
I think we have one of the most convoluted and complicated procurement procedures anywhere in the world. It's a wonder that we don't drive away suppliers and sellers, because this is a kind of procurement procedure should defeat the most determined of sellers. And we keep complicating it more and more. For example, this whole complication of now make and buy. Now, Ministry of Defense is not the Ministry of Industry, nor are the armed forces responsible, do they bear the burden of promoting Indian industry. It's not their job. Their job is to be fighting fit and be prepared for all circumstances. So when they choose something, they should not be burdened with the thought that which is the choice which is going to support Indian production, which is the choice which is going to. They should focus purely on their operational requirements. Why should they have to be burdened with that? And with these kind of considerations which we keep adding on, we A, add to the cost, B, we add to the delay, and by the time we come to procurement, we've already reached a stage where technology may have changed or may have gone very much further. So we are constantly, say, 10 years behind what is the best and the latest. So that's,
this point that you make about this convoluted decision-making process that we have. We'll come back to that in a moment, because currently the Modi government and Mr. Parikar, the defense minister, they have been talking about the focus on Make in India in the long term, and specific to MOD, they have spoken about the new guidelines, the DPP with the offset. But we'll come back to that in a moment. Matt, I want to get you in on this because you were you were the chairman of that report, right? You authored a Matheswaran committee report.
That's right, in 2014.
So can you just share with us, we'll only talk about the aircraft and the aerospace industry as it were. Why is it that India continues to be so dependent on the foreign supplier, as Mr. Pande was saying, that the Indian Air Force needs to be fighting fit? So what are the constraints in terms of our ability to make within the country, and how does the Air Force go about this?
In one short sentence, if I just answer that issue, is the lack of a very coherent national strategy. And I must actually, let's first be very clear that the aerospace and aeronautics is at the high end of technological excellence of a country. So, for example, if you've been able to design, develop and manufacture an aero engine, then as a country, you arrived in the international system as a great power. Let me put it in that much. Of course, there are many things that go into it, materials and all these capabilities come into it. But for all that to be put together, you need to actually have a national strategy that works on, that addresses research and development, that addresses the industry, addresses the development of ecosystem, and more importantly, addresses the academic environment for developing skilled manpower. This requirement of a national strategy can only come about through what is known as, what has been recommended over the years many times over, is the National Aeronautics Commission, or I recommended as the National Aerospace Commission. Surprisingly, such a recommendation was made as early as 1969 by C. Subramaniam Committee. And there are many committees, including my last one, which have recommended that this is absolutely necessary, and it should function on the model of the ISRO and the atomic energy directly under the Prime Minister to actually energize the whole process.
Is there a Tamil Nadu factor here? You talk about C. Subramaniam and now, anyway, but you know.
But what is interesting is, repeatedly, various committees have agreed to that recommendation. Government has also agreed to that recommendation, and that's
But we have not been able to.
not been followed because invariably, I would say quite bluntly, the MOD and the Defence Secretary have vetoed that we can look after, Department of Defence Production can look after this process. We don't need an aeronautics company.
Because MOD thinks it's also industry. But anyway, I'll come back to that. PK, I'm going to pick this up because you use the word ecosystem. Now, let me play devil's advocate here. While we say that we have not made any significant progress as far as aerospace is concerned, yet for all these constraints, India has acquired nuclear weapons. We have a certain credibility as far as satellites are concerned. And we are currently also about to make significant progress as far as nuclear propulsion is concerned in the submarine. So how do you contrast these two? And why is it that the ecosystem works there, but not in aircraft?
Actually, if you look at the ecosystem, less for the sake of, you mentioned about space, which we are very proud of as a country, that we have done things there. But if you look at the launches we do per annum, they are 2 to 3. As against there is a requirement of 10 to 12, which ISRO is now thinking of doing it. What I'm saying, all our chain, if you talk of the supply chain, is star connected to the one star, or ISRO, everybody reports to ISRO. You take case of HAL, whatever vendors are there, they all go and deal with ISRO. So if you want to really set up an ecosystem, it needs a hierarchy. And it also needs, if you really ask me with respect to public sector and private sector, having lived in both the domains and worked as an executive, not as an advisor, I feel there has to be role clarity, not role conflict. So
Not role conflict?
Conflict.
Okay. Oh, that's good.
See, at the moment, I can't be competing. If you have anyone competing with HAL in the aerospace domain, it would be an undoing. It won't work out. And they can be corrosive competition. So if you look at the sum total of what other countries which have been successful, like you take the case of South Korea, you take the case of Brazil, you take any other case, Japan for that matter, they have done in one way or another some market segmentation. Okay, you are going to make aero engines, you will make aero engines. There are not n number of players in aero engines. You are not doing tendering for every time you need an aero engine. You make landing gears, you do the landing gears. You are doing avionics, you do the avionics.
So you're saying specialization would be desirable?
So there's a specialization because this area, as Matheswaran has pointed out already, is very capital intensive, technology intensive, and it has cyclic demand. You have a demand now because we are trying to change all our weapon systems. This will wean off. And the 10-year span, there will be no demand in our own demand. So you need to depend on the demand from the external demands. So unless you establish, you create a niche for your industry, that means you do the market segmentation and you have a National Aeronautics Commission. I was also part of the task force which is trying to figure this out. Actually, there's no oversight committee. There's no way you can interact with the government. If you allow me to say one point, I would say in government, when I was in public sector, what was my key point? I could walk up to the government and talk to him and talk about my problem. Being in private sector, I don't have that liberty. So if there's somebody who's overseeing in the cadre about if we have to follow the same method what Secretary has said, we should have somebody for private sector too.
So you make the same point that there's a need for a commission equivalent and segmentation of the... Amitabh, can I get this to you? Meaning that as far as the ministry itself is concerned, what can we do now? We are now in 2016. For about 30 years, we've been deliberating. I mean, I can go back to Mrs. Indira Gandhi's time when similar kind of effort was made about the need for India for indigenization. But in 2016, the market being what it is, India being what it is, what would you recommend to your current, shall we say, counterpart in MOD?
Well, I think there are two distinct issues. One is the question of the structure of decision making which exists today, which is not only convoluted and complicated, but because we have three different kingdoms within the empire of the Ministry of Defence.
Three different kingdoms.
Three different kingdoms,
that, I think.
And each of those kingdoms has a set of dukedoms and earldoms and other fiefdoms, each of which is almost an independent entity by itself.
For our viewers, just explain which are the three kingdoms?
The kingdom is Department of Defence, Department of Defence Production, and Department of Defence Research. And
they have three secretaries. There is a Defence Secretary, a Secretary DP, and a Secretary DRDO.
You also have a minor kingdom called Defence Finance.
Okay.
And then you have other minor kingdoms like DGQA and and so on, each of which functions in separate silos. Now, there is no, we talk of interministerial coordination, we don't have intra-ministerial coordination here. Absolutely no coordination, and they are virtually at war with each other most of the time. So unless we really completely wind up these three different kingdoms, merge them into one kingdom at best, make that kingdom as autonomous as possible and free of constraints, and simplify. We need to simplify procedures in a dramatic, radical way. And that simplification is not coming because we are constantly, we distrust everyone. We are subjecting ourselves to audits and inquiries and vigilance procedures in a way in which we constrain ourselves and make the procedures still more complicated because we want to CYA.
Okay, we'll leave it at that. But Matt, I'm going to come back to you. I know he's said many things which are very radical, and in many ways I would say they reflect an opinion that has been said many times, that MOD needs to be rewired. But I'll leave it for a moment because that's a big subject. I want to come back to the aircraft. Now, one of the points about the aerospace industry is this whole question of the complexity of the engine. So can you help us understand, for instance, who are the big players in terms of engine manufacture, engine design, and what is the Asian, shall we say, grid? How does it look?
Well, the big players are in the four big countries. I mean, the US, Russians, British, and French.
Okay.
Okay.
The traditional,
big
five, big four, yeah.
Big four, and Germany is there. Germany, I mean, you know the kind of industries that actually developed the military power in the Second World War time, and a massive amount of research material was there, which were actually taken out and benefited both US and former Soviet Union, phenomenally. But in recent, after 50s, Japan has
also
come back, because Japan was also a great power during the...
It has a great pedigree. I mean, Japan has an industrial
and therefore
power.
they were able to actually bring back their wealth. And they went through the civilian model, and then they are now, they are at that level. South Korea is an interesting example. Of course, there's background support to South Korea from the US side, which cannot be ignored. That's an important input. But nevertheless, they've been able to develop in a competitive process a very excellent aerospace capabilities, and therefore they've got the T-50, A-50 aircraft, which is more or less like the LCA. With the other aspect of it. Engine, some of them, like Embraer and South Korea, decide to leave the engine because it's a very complex one and try and do it little later. The mistakes that we made was that we attempted, for example, in the LCA domain, we attempted both aircraft and engine development together.
Concurrently.
And they will never match. Okay? Because engine needs a dedicated team and dedicated effort. And if you really actually want to actually develop, then you need to actually, because we are starting from scratch, some of those areas, and now it's too late, but at that time in 60s and 70s, we should have brought in some partners, not easy to get, and have them partners for life or for a long term.
Are we now moving in that direction? We are talking about the fifth generation with the Russians. Is that going anywhere?
The fifth generation, there is a problem in that fifth generation fighter program, because the aircraft is already developed. Much of the prototype is already done. So how much of technology benefit would you gain? You probably would gain much in the production technology. But the research, design, development process, you probably missed it out.
But in any case, Moscow is in the driver's seat as far as
Moscow in the
this
driver's
program.
seat.
But PK, I want to bring you back onto this. Whatever Matt has said on this, what can the private sector do now to enable, whatever be the Indian aspiration as far as aerospace is concerned? What can private sector do?
See, we look at it like this way. Suppose you bought this aircraft and we have offset clause. We also have earmarked 30% for the research and development organizations and 20% for the production side. If we leverage this, the thought was that we have a big market size as of now for aerospace.
Within India,
our own market size. Can we leverage this to create business opportunity for our own industry? Okay, given the fact that Matsy has already elaborated that we are not at that place at tier 1 level where we can really do this job. So if we look at the deal which has been done now, we will need what we call NTBF determined spares. We'll also need what we call TTL determined spares, and we'll also need what we call manufacturer recommended list of spares. So this is part of the deal itself. At the moment, the offset gets discharged in the way of components. That you do the components go to the host country makes the module, which is the purchasable thing, then it comes here. Can we go ahead and do the parts of this? We decide, okay, we will do now what is needed by the Indian Air Force. So if we dovetail that, we'll have one advantage, that in sustenance period beyond PBL, performance-based logistics, of 5 years, we can have our own industry supporting to a large extent, which can grow further. That could be next benchmark.
So that could be the way
So that's
ahead.
why how I see the private sector can come in and then go ahead.
Can I request you, Amitabh, what has been your assessment and experience of how MOD has looked at this kind of involvement of the private sector for the long term? Is there an institutional view?
Well, I don't think MOD as such, because the view on this has to be taken by the Department of Defense Production, because this is their domain. Department of Defense Production is weighed down by the enormously gigantic investments which have taken place in creating indigenous capacity in the public sector and the ordnance factory.
The defense PSUs.
The defense PSUs and the ordnance factory board. Now, we forget the size of the investment in these places. Now, these investments have become such a dead weight on the state, they have such a drag on the system, that today most of them are functioning at 10% of their capacity, 20% of their capacity, and the armed forces have to buy from them just to sustain them to some minimum level of business. You mentioned BDL, he was on the board of BDL. I remember that time when BDL was really scrounging around for making dispensers for petrol pumps. That was one of the things that they thought of making, because so starved were they of orders. Now you have a huge drag on the system like that.
So that
So
needs
now
perhaps to be dissolved.
Is private industry going to make a difference? Do you expect the private industry to now make similar investments and then be
So we need to review this. A quick
There is
30-second,
a sort of a issue that we need to be very clear about. All over the world, I mean, particularly the major arms exporting countries have developed their defense industrial system with strong government support.
And we need something like that.
Okay, now,
Matt, I'm going to request you to hold that. Maybe we'll get you back at some point. But on this, in the interest of time, let me just say that the Rafale agreement is an important decision and has many implications for India. The Indian Air Force will soon field one of the most modern and advanced combat platforms in Asia, and the versatility of the Rafale will provide a critical edge to Indian air power. However, India has to acquire the competence to manufacture its own aircraft and hopefully design its own high-tech military platforms. That, of course, is the long-term objective, and the Rafale agreement can provide the necessary trigger pulse if the appropriate policy framework is evolved. And for that, many radical decisions need to be taken to alter the existing status quo. And as our discussion indicated, the Indian private sector and academia must be encouraged and enabled to become stakeholders for the long haul. The national high technology manufacturing ecosystem also needs an infusion of resources and resolve, and hopefully the Rafale will catalyze this effort. On that note, allow me to thank my guests, Air Marshal Matheswaran, Air Marshal Srivastava, and Mr. Pande. Thank you for watching Security Scan. Goodbye.